It was covertly funded by the CIA, but it was an instrument of the CIA. So our chief cultural propagandist during the Cold War was this exiled Russian aristocrat who hated the Soviet Union to such a degree that he denied that there was such a thing as Soviet culture, and he lampooned as insignificant the music of Shostakovich.
Hello, I'm Thomas Fortner, and welcome to my new series called State of Our Art. In this series, we will explore music of the past and the present, and I hope to answer questions like, why do we create? How do we create? What's some of the secrets of the creative process? And how can classical music move towards a brighter future? My guest today is a former New York Times music critic. He's the author of 10 books exploring music in American life, and is a leading thinker in redefining the future of arts organizations in this country. Joseph Horowitz is the co-founder and executive producer of the Post-Classical Ensemble, based in Washington, D.C. The Post-Classical Ensemble is an experimental symphonic laboratory which has produced immersive experiences exploring themes such as Stravinsky in Russia, Charles Ives' America, the Mexican Revolution, and interpreting Shostakovich. Joe is a frequent collaborator with my orchestra, the South Dakota Symphony, where he helped bring our groundbreaking Lakota music project to our nation's capital. He is currently producing an online video series called More Than Music, which poses the question, what is the role of culture in a nation's life? Links to these videos can be found at postclassical.com. I'm thrilled to welcome my very first guest on this new podcast and video series, Joseph Horowitz.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Thomas.
We were talking a little bit before we started rolling about your current project that you've been working on in quarantine. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, my book is on the cultural Cold War. I stumbled on something that fascinated me, that when Kennedy was president, he was urging Americans to pay more attention to culture, meaning, traditional Western high culture.
Right.
And advocating for a national cultural center, which became the Kennedy Center. But he did so within the rhetoric of the Cold War, and he made a claim that is false. He said that great art is only produced by free artists in free societies, and that's clearly counter-empirical. I was so staggered by that that I took an interest in where this idea came from, and I was able to trace it to a man named Nicholas Nabokov, who was a minor composer, a cousin of the famous Vladimir Nabokov. And Nabokov, who was very close to Stravinsky, was the head of the CIA's cultural propaganda agency, which was called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was covertly funded by the CIA, but it was an instrument of the CIA. So our chief cultural propagandist during the Cold War was this exiled Russian aristocrat who hated the Soviet Union to such a degree that he denied that there was such a thing as Soviet culture, and he lampooned as insignificant the music of Shostakovich. And all of this made its way to the White House via his friend Arthur Schlesinger, who then scripted these speeches for Kennedy, in which Kennedy claimed that a, quote, totalitarian state was inimical with great cultural achievement. And that is the starting point of my book. What we were talking about before, which is more relevant to our conversation, is that if you study culture in the Soviet Union, you realize how much more culture mattered to the state than it does here in the United States, especially under Lenin and Lunacharsky. After the revolution, the cultural life, the musical life of Leningrad and Moscow in the 20s and early 30s was far more progressive than the musical life of the New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera in New York City.
What do you think arts organizations, particularly orchestras, what do you think they should be doing most immediately to deal with this COVID? And then let's say when the virus is no longer a threat, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I've long maintained that orchestras live in a very small world, that they're not major players in the cultural life of their communities or in the nation at large, and that they should be. You work for an orchestra that is. I don't know of a more innovative orchestra in the United States today than the South Dakota Symphony. Under David Geyer has created, as you well know, the Lakota Music Project, which links to Indian reservations. And David is somebody who's a thinker. I wish it was more common. And he thinks about, what can my orchestra do for my community? He lives in the community. He's raised children in the community. He goes to church in the community. And he knows the community. It matters. It really does. So he shapes the orchestra's identity and its programming with regard to his knowledge of Sioux Falls and the state generally, and what particularly defines and challenges the state, in particular, the troubled relationship with the Native American community. Would that all orchestras were similarly disposed? Will they be more disposed in the wake of the pandemic is an interesting question. My own orchestra, Post-Classical Ensemble, is creating a series of videos. Rather than streaming concerts, we're creating videos based on our past programming, all of which is thematic and deals with larger issues. We're calling it More Than Music, and so far we've produced 3. The first was called Deep River, The Art of the Spiritual, and it's about Harry Burleigh. The second was called Shostakovich and the State, and it features Solomon Volkov talking about Shostakovich and Stalin. And the third, this Sunday, is a film called Shostakovich in Time of War, which contrasts the musical responses to World War II of 3 Russian composers, Shostakovich, Stravinsky, and Prokofiev. What I most look forward to is doing something with our Naxos DVD, in which we have the New Deal documentaries, The Plow That Broke the Plains and the River from the 30s, with newly recorded soundtracks, and commentary by the late George Stoney, then in his 90s, who was a surviving New Dealer, who was the public information officer for the Southern United States when these films were first released. So this DVD, this project, deals with the question, what is the role of the federal government in times of crisis? And it's directly pertinent to the present moment. And that pertinence is something that can be extrapolated and discussed when we turn this into a More Than Music video. So, and these videos are being linked to Zoom chats, like the one we're about to have, or the one we're having now. Our upcoming Zoom chat on Wednesday is with Solomon Volkov, who collaborated with Shostakovich on his memoirs. When we get back into action, whenever that might be, one of our first undertakings will be a festival about reclaiming Black classical music in collaboration with Howard University. We just did a festival with the South Dakota Symphony called Native American Inspirations that dealt with music by Native and non-Native composers inspired by the Native American experience. And predictably, it proved very controversial because of identity politics and the ruckus about cultural appropriation that afflicts our intellectual life. So we're in the eye of the storm, and we confront and articulate directly issues of American culture that seem to matter most.
Granted that we're both within this bubble, this really rather small bubble of the classical music world, let's first of all define classical music, and secondly, maybe you can speak to the cultural perception of classical music in our, let's just say American society for now.
I no longer use that term except to refer to something that's over and done with. I use the term post-classical music, which is why my orchestra is called Post-Classical Ensemble. And your orchestra, South Dakota Symphony, also lives in a post-classical world. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Native American drummers taking part in your orchestra concerts. Classical music is a term, this is a long story, I'll try to make it short, that seems to have been coined for Americans by John Dwight
Right.
in the mid-19th century. If you trace the etymology of this term, it's not very pleasant because Dwight was a snob. And what he was doing was distinguishing classical music from all that other music which isn't as good. And that poisoned the notion of classical music pretty much permanently, to the point where at some point in the late 20th century, it became untenable because of what it represented, and that was no longer a viable statement. It had become an obnoxious statement.
Yeah.
So I think orchestras should do everything they can to escape the confines of classical music. And the question becomes, what can you do as an orchestra? It's easier for a chamber orchestra or a chamber music society than for an orchestra to escape the confines of classical music. I set that challenge to myself when I ran the Brooklyn Philharmonic in the 1990s. And I thought it's pretty easy, actually. For one thing, I was at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which embraced a very eclectic and large world of culture. And secondly, the orchestra was committed to experimentation because it had lost over 2/3 of its subscribers over a period of 2 years. And when Harvey Lichtenstein invited me to take over that orchestra, he made it clear that there was nothing to lose. I could do whatever I wanted. And I said, I want to do thematic cross-disciplinary programs. He said, fine. So we did. And we would regularly have a folk ensemble from Russia, or a Hungarian folk band, or a gamelan ensemble, or a Balinese and a Javanese gamelan ensemble. We were constantly transcending these barriers that had confined and defined classical music. And it actually made our programming more exciting and popular. And it was less expensive than hiring celebrity soloists, which orchestras, it's a terrible habit that orchestras acquired in this country of basing their finances on the draw of a very expensive celebrity who could maybe open their season, or having a series of such celebrities playing warhorse concertos because it seemed the easiest and simplest and most reliable way to generate box office, even though it was very expensive to pay the celebrities. We did an audience survey in Brooklyn, and one of the questions was, how do you feel about having celebrity soloists? And there was no interest. Even though we'd had Guido Kramer, because I thought he was a great musician, our audience didn't miss the celebrities because they were in a different track. We were doing the Russian Stravinsky or flamenco, or a Charles Ives festival. And there was a sufficient interest to do that kind of programming. I don't imagine that it can be done everywhere, but as you know, during the period that I was running the NEH program, Music Unwound, in which the South Dakota Symphony was a partner, and producing programming all over the United States without celebrity soloists that was driven by themes, it was popular. So there is an option. There is an alternative. I still don't see that there's much movement towards embracing it.
You've talked a lot about orchestras being a lot like museums. The institution of the orchestra is equivalent to an institution of a museum. I've always said that the symphony orchestra, as we know it, at least in this country, is essentially an 1800s cover band. And we make other forays into that. And I know you talked about this, particularly in your classical music in America book. Could you talk about the history of maybe where this went wrong? Because I know specifically you talk about Dvorak.
Well, I like museums. Museums curate the past. Orchestras don't. Museums are way ahead of orchestras. You can go to a museum and they'll do a thematic exhibit about, I'm trying to think of a specific example at the Metropolitan Museum, Thomas Cole. They did a Thomas Cole exhibit. So who is Thomas Cole? He was the artist who taught and inspired Frederick Church. Who was Frederick Church? Frederick Church was by far the most iconic, most influential American painter in the 1850s and 1860s, and he is a pioneering figure. And it was via Frederick Church that the Hudson River School was born, and landscape became the defining genre for American painting. And this is a wonderfully curated exhibit with excellent text. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if orchestras did the same thing? They would do a festival on John Knowles Paine and his influence on George Chadwick. Because George Chadwick and John Knowles Paine are our two first important composers of symphonies. And the difference was that Chadwick composed music, some of which sounds American, and Paine composed music, none of which sounds American. But when Chadwick heard Paine's First Symphony, conducted by Theodore Thomas, he said, I went home fortified by the knowledge that an American composer could write a great symphony. So this is a great story, and our orchestras don't know these pieces. They don't know this story. They're not historically knowledgeable the way that curators are at art museums. It's a huge difference.
What is our relationship currently with music in
I think in the classical music realm, we're still in the throes of figuring out what happened with modernism. Modernism was both an opportunity and a crisis. And the crisis was a crisis of audience.
Can we define modernism? Can you give some composers examples?
I think that the modernist aesthetic was more about art for art's sake than the previous norm. And rather notoriously, modernist composers didn't care about the audience. This is not necessarily a bad thing. You can understand a composer feeling, I have a vision, I want to be true to my vision, I'm not going to compromise. But be that as it may, the two seminal modernist composers, at least it used to be the conventional wisdom that the two seminal modernist composers were Stravinsky and Schoenberg. And I find myself spending a lot of time trying to finally figure out how I feel about what they did. I'm at heart a romantic. I'm a Wagner guy.
Yeah.
So I'm more disposed towards Schoenberg than I am towards Stravinsky because my sympathies are more German than French. And I'm talking about Stravinsky as a Francophile.
Yeah, right.
Let's not get distracted by the other topic of whether he was always really a Russian composer. And to be frank, my personal feeling at this point is that I don't care for Stravinsky as a person. This is a terribly presumptuous thing to say, but I've read a fair amount about Stravinsky and I know his music to some degree. And I think there's an act of almost disdain written into his music. And it was aggravated by his own isolation, especially, and I'm writing about this now in my book on the Cultural Cold War, especially when he got to Los Angeles. He's autonomous and he doesn't regret it. He says, he writes about it. In his Norton lectures, he says, the composer is autonomous. The creative act is autonomous. Music doesn't mean anything beyond the notes. Personally, I don't buy it. And I don't much buy music that buys it. I think that Schoenberg, who more engaged with Los Angeles, who more engaged with America, who played tennis with Gershwin, who esteemed the music of Gershwin and Ives, who gave lessons to the Hollywood composers, I think he was creatively more fulfilled in the United States than Stravinsky. I think when he wrote the Ode to Napoleon and Survivor from Warsaw and was, enraged by what Hitler had done, he wasn't being autonomous. He was inspired by the world around him and motivated to seek expression in music that is very deeply felt. But at the same time, not many people know these pieces. And the barrier to entry is not as high as we suppose, but still, if you're talking about Schoenberg and Stravinsky, you're talking about shrinking an audience and taking those composers and putting them, if not in an ivory tower, at least in a place that's more cut off from what had traditionally been the audience for classical music than was previously the case. And then you go to high modernists, let's say Elliott Carter or Pierre Boulez. Is that music going to live, Thomas? I do know that if we have a canon, if we have a mainstream repertoire for orchestra, you're a conductor, I would say with some certainty that it ends with the 10th Symphony of Dmitri Shostakovich, composed in 1953. A very great symphony, by the way. But what comes after it? Well, if your criterion is, does it get played? Nothing comes after it. Maybe that's the wrong criterion, but it's very strange, is it not, and highly unpredicted, that around 1950, the canon ends.
Yeah.
Piano canon, opera canon, symphonic canon, that's already over half a century ago. So what happened after that in classical music, and what are we to make of it? Certainly there was a blurring of the boundaries, what we talked about before, which is not a bad thing. Maybe you can read the whole thing as a transition, or maybe it's irrelevant to apply the criterion of popularity, but for sure, there was a crisis. And I think we're still unpacking that crisis. And in this country, part of that crisis is the question, what are orchestras for?
Yeah.
It's not a problem for museums because somehow visual art has maintained currency, and there's far greater interest in the museum-going public for contemporary visual art than there is in the orchestra public for contemporary symphonic music. So orchestras, having been deprived or having deprived themselves, because they're not guiltless, of a living repertoire, that's a challenge.
What is the importance of having a living repertoire?
Because when you recirculate that music, it gets tired and mannered. It loses its freshness. And if you're like me, although many people are not, most people are not, I'll take an old recording over a new recording any day. I'm a pianist. I was listening to Courteau last night play the G minor ballade by Chopin because I'm writing a book in which a major figure is Van Cliburn, right?
Right.
So I've been listening to a lot of Van Cliburn. And I was listening to Byron Janis and these other artists who made a great impression in Russia. And they play Chopin. So I wanted to clean my ears out. And I know a lot of Courteau's Chopin, but I'd never heard his recording of the G minor ballade. So I went on YouTube and I listened to it. And it's transcendently great. Why was it easier to be a great exponent of Chopin in 1935 than in 2020? I don't think that's such a hard question to answer, because the music, it was younger and it hadn't yet calcified into certain routinized ways of playing it and hearing it. Yeah. There was a far greater range of options. What do you do with this music? When you've heard a piece that as often as the G minor ballade, ironically, the range of possible interpretations doesn't expand, it shrinks.
Yeah, I think maybe we're a victim potentially currently to the ideas of performance practice and authenticity.
Yeah, that also screwed us up terribly, because there's no such thing as authenticity. We can't turn back the clock. We can't live in the 19th century. We can't live in the 18th century. If that movement did anything that was of any good, it shook up our conventional wisdom about how peace goes. I once did a show with Bill McLaughlin. In fact, I've done several of them, listening to old symphonic recordings. And we were listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The first recording of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is Arthur Nikisch and the Berlin Philharmonic. Mm-hmm. And that recording is most interesting for the oboe cadenza in the first movement. Mm-hmm. Nikisch does something that would never happen today, which is that he slows down and slows down, then the oboe plays, and then he starts slowly and gets faster and faster, none of which is in the score. So one of us, I guess it was Bill, picked John Elliott Gardner just to find a recording that was authentic, okay, and see what that sounded like in comparison. And it sounded like shit.
It's a passing curiosity. I personally, as a cellist in university, I had two extremes, two rather important influences at the same time.
Yeah.
With opposing viewpoints. Yeah. And of course, intellectually, I understand the idea behind you want to follow what's in the score. And you could even say, I don't know what you call it ethically, but it's what the composer's intentions were. We try to our best understand what they wrote, and then do our best, our good faith effort to reproduce that.
Yeah, I was never seduced by that.
Yeah, and I often argue the reason why I fell in love with classical music was not because I went to see an orchestra play an incredibly authentic Mozart symphony. That's not why I fell in love with it. In fact, a couple of years ago played in an orchestra conducted by a dear friend of mine in Canada, who has been a longtime fan of Furtwängler. He managed to find the parts of the New York Philharmonic, or the Berlin Philharmonic, the string parts that were marked by those musicians from the 1940s, 1950s, under Furtwängler, and we used them. And he, for example, did the Eroica Symphony, da dee da, very much in three, very much different. And I found it to be one of the most compelling performances I'd ever been on.
Oh, wow. Yeah. You know, there is a conductor today who's completely unpredictable and breaks with tradition in that piece, which is Gergiev. I heard Gergiev play the Eroica Symphony with the Munich Philharmonic as a Russian symphony. Yeah. Very heavy, no staccato, slow tempos, thick sound. No one could possibly mistake that as an attempt to authentically render the score. It was a memorable performance. I'm not saying it's my favorite performance, but it was a performance. I mean, you walked away from that knowing you'd heard something. You had to respond to it. It was impressive.
Yeah. I've often been preached to that we serve the music.
No, forget it.
And that is our main topic. And
forget it.
It's our responsibility to serve the audience and to serve ourselves. To
serve yourself. I mean, inhabit the music, wherever it takes you.
Yeah.
That's simplistic, but you know, I've written a lot about Furtwängler recently because I finally paid $250 and bought the entire set of his wartime performances, which is 21 CDs. And what's very clear is not only does he live, it's his explicit contention, and he gets it from Wagner in Wagner's essay on conducting, that the most important thing when you're interpreting a piece is to find the idea. It's not the notes in the score. What's it about? And it's the hardest thing to find, Wagner says. Of course, it's very hard to find. But Furtwängler does that and one thing more. If he's conducting the Eroica Symphony, sure, he'll have an idea what it's about. But it'll also be an embodiment of the moment. And 1945 is not the same moment as 1930. And if you listen to Furtwängler performances, The Brahms one that he does in 1945 it's channeling Berlin, 1945, the city in rubbles. It's all there. So this is very far from serving the composer in the conventional sense, but I do think it does serve the composer. Because these artworks, Brahms one, they don't have a fixed meaning. They're powerful enough that they can mold themselves to different times and places. And Furtwängler runs with that.
I have another dear friend, conductor and composer, pianist, who has confided in me that he thinks we should stop playing old music, period. And he's got a very Boulesian sort of streak of,
right.
This is it. I think it's a rather interesting point of view. Arguably, it would probably not work. It's rather extreme. But
there are artists who don't play old music.
Do you think there is a place in your ideal conception of a post-classical world where we still perform Tchaikovsky and Beethoven and Brahms and the sort of canon greats that supposedly sell tickets?
My orchestra doesn't specialize in contemporary music. The more the music shows that I did would take a piece. It was sometimes the New World Symphony by Dvorak. Sometimes it was the film Redes, the music by Revueltas. Sometimes it was the Seven Deadly Sins by Kurt Weill, and contextualize it. So to what extent is that necessary or desirable? I wouldn't dare contextualize the Shostakovich Eighth Symphony performed by Gergiev in the Mariinsky Theater Orchestra in the city of St. Petersburg. But if you do Shostakovich Eighth in South Dakota, you got to contextualize it. I think it's a no-brainer. There's no way to play that piece, or Shostakovich 10 or Shostakovich 5, where you live in Sioux Falls and serve your audience without at least saying something about it.
Right.
And you asked me earlier off camera if I've ever done programs with Shostakovich as a reenacted character. And I said, yeah, I've done 3 of them. And they all worked. And they're not tacky and kitschy either.
Right.
I do think I'm picking a special case that I have a rather extreme view of these works, especially the 10th Symphony, which is, if you don't know what's going on in that symphony, you've lost a lot. There's no making up for the fact that you need to know that Stalin and Shostakovich are characters in that symphony. I'm sorry. If you don't know that, you're missing something that you need to know. Whether that's true. When I worked for the Pacific Symphony with Carl St. Clair, we did programming around Bruckner IX and Mahler IX. And those were necessary exercises for that audience. Whether we would have done a program on Beethoven V or Mozart Jupiter Symphony, we never did. I can't, it would be a challenge. So there's contextualization. I like doing programs that require contextualization because I have a very didactic bent. I'm much more interested in presenting music which the audience doesn't know than I am presenting music that the audience does know. So almost all of the programming that I do in DC is with music that the audience doesn't know. And I feel a responsibility to advocate for that music as ingeniously and powerfully as I can. So everything we do is contextualized programming.
The few concerts that I very distinctly remember from my childhood, one of them was Bartók's Bluebeard Castle with the Houston Symphony stage, and another one was the Alpine Symphony. In both cases, they had a very large visual component. So for the Bartók, I very distinctly remember the very opening, they shut down all the lights. The orchestra played from memory, that pentatonic unison thing.
Great. Was that with Eschenbach?
No, that was with Hans Graf, actually. This is after
I see.
Eschenbach.
Yeah.
And there was just enough ambient light to
Yeah.
see the honeycomb in the ceiling, and it felt very dungeonous.
Yeah.
And they also had, underneath each orchestra musician's chair, there was fabric that had different colored lights. So the orchestra itself became the setting for these two characters. And it was completely transfixing. A similar effect happened with Alpine Symphony. Maybe I just like music played in the dark, but they started with the sunrise and ended with the sunset. In both cases, light was a major part, as well as images.
Was that also with Graf?
That was also with Hans Graf.
I can tell you a story that when Dmitri Mitropoulos did the Alpine Symphony of the New York Philharmonic, he wanted to have titles. And the orchestra said no, which is to say Judson said no, because that was probably, 1945, 1950. That was a completely, and Bruno Walter also advised the orchestra, don't do it.
Yeah.
That was unthinkable at that moment in time. Were there visuals for the Alpine Symphony or just lighting?
Yes. So then I'm going completely on years old childhood memory, but there was some lighting, but mostly it was a visual slideshow of pictures taken in the Alps, live by a musician.
Sounds very dangerous to me.
the triggering it live thing.
I can imagine using titles for the different segments of the symphony, but using photographs sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah, that's
very dangerous to add a visual element.
Absolutely. What I found one of the more transfixing things about the Radiohead concert that I saw was the very abstract nature of the visuals that they had.
There you go. Yeah.
So they were playing their album in rainbows, and they literally had these, I don't know what they were made out of, but everywhere there was these things hanging down, and it wasn't just light, it was like these incredibly expensive LED fixtures of rainbow light. And they had live cameras focused on the faces of all the band members, but it was manipulated. And so you weren't looking at something literal. It was just this thing that hypnotized you somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, that can all be organic. We just did a concert called Armenian Odyssey.
Yeah.
In fact, I would like to reference postclassical.com to your viewers if they want to see a clip on the homepage of our website of a concert which had an ongoing visual component, but the whole thing was conceived as an entity. The visual artist, Kevork Murad, and the composer, Vacha Sharafian, and I created this as a multimedia creation. And I saw something that two of them did in New York, Kevork Murad and Vacha Sharafian, and I was stunned at how synergistic the music and the visuals were. Because as you know, when you do that, if either component dominates the other, it's fatal.
Yeah.
If one becomes an accompaniment to the other, you diminish the whole. But if you can create this kind of magic equivalence so that they seem to feed off of one another, a lot can happen. And I think we succeeded. And if you're curious to know what it looks like to do that, you can go to our homepage and see an excerpt. I was very happy with that concert. It was certainly not the case that we were illustrating the music.
Right.
We were co-creating a visual and a musical component of a single entity.
Right. And oftentimes the argument, as you even said with Mitropoulos, is that you don't want to distract from the music. But I find that I need something. I don't know if it's because I'm a millennial and I'm constantly on the internet and I need visual stimulus because I'm ADD or something. But I have a feeling that a lot of people are like this, that the experience of listening to the music can be enhanced if you do it right, if you add the right visual.
I'm not a millennial, and that notion makes me nervous. I think you can set up the music in all kinds of creative ways, but when the Bruckner IX is playing, and I think we did a good job in Orange County with an audience that was new to Bruckner, setting up the Bruckner IX. Carl insisted that the orchestra not play in the first half. He didn't want to play excerpts. I thought that was very shrewd. We
Yeah.
used an organ instead
Ah,
to set it up, and we had some Bach on the first half as well. And then the second half with the Bruckner IX, there were no visual elements whatsoever. And it was very, very engrossing, very moving.
I found actually, I think this was the last time I saw Eschenbach conduct was in Washington. He
Yeah,
was the director doing a Bruckner VIII concert.
yeah.
And at that point, I had not been a Bruckner fan, and I was, don't tell David Geyer, but I came from the Mahler camp and decided to jump into the Bruckner bandwagon after that experience, because I saw Mahler VIII that same year, that same summer with Eschenbach doing it in Houston, with Bruckner VIII being in DC, and I found Bruckner to be much more of an enthralling experience of listening.
Oh, hey, Mahler VIII is a weak Mahler symphony. Bruckner VIII is a strong Bruckner symphony.
Yeah.
It's not a fair comparison.
Right.
Yeah, Bruckner VIII is a stronger piece than Mahler VIII, that's for sure.
Yeah, Mahler VIII can be a bit of a circus. I mean, it was.
I don't think Mahler VIII is a good idea. I think
We pulled it off pretty well here, but then again, I didn't have an opportunity to be an audience member because I was so busy counting, getting ready to conduct the kids on stage. Looping back to visuals and music, we've been incorporating visuals more and more.
I know that.
In our work, yeah. And I found for myself, we were doing Hindemith's Matthijs.
I know all about this program, and I told David beforehand, it'll work for the Hindemith and it won't work for the Mussorgsky. And he said to me, "You're right." After the concert, you were right. The Mussorgsky was diminished and the Hindemith was enhanced.
Yeah, I thought that the Hindemith, which I've never been a huge fan of Hindemith, and I've heard a good deal of his music.
Yeah,
I found the visuals to be extremely helpful, and as the person who literally was triggering the visuals, I found it enhancing, partly because, well, there's a very close link between the music and the art. I mean,
it's about the artist, and he's evoking that art in the music. And when I don't think he was entirely successful extrapolating a suite. I don't think the opera is entirely successful, although it has great moments. And that suite, I think it needs a little help. You need to be in touch with Grunewald. Unless you've got a vivid image in your brain of what Grunewald's art looks like, you're going to be, if it's well done, you're going to like it more and get deeper into it if you can see some Grunewald. Whereas the pictures in an exhibition, that's a terrible idea. They're there in the music. You don't need any help because the music gives you so much information. You can draw your own picture. You don't need anybody to draw it for you.
What do you think about Fantasia?
I like Fantasia.
How is that different, though?
Because it's not a concert. The Pastoral Symphony is about 20 minutes long, right? I don't know when you last saw Fantasia, but that Pastoral Symphony is really just excerpts from the Pastoral Symphony. And the musical performance is not in any way an attempt to be true to the composer. It's Stokowski. Yeah. That's a very beautiful performance of excerpts from the Pastoral Symphony by a conductor who's in his own world. And that world easily accommodates the visual material. If you went through Fantasia piece by piece, I think the high point is the Dance of the Hours. That's a masterpiece with the dancing alligators and hippopotami. That's great. I'm just trying to. The repertoire is well chosen. Yeah. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, The Night on Bald Mountain. There's no Beethoven V in there. When they did their second Fantasia with Beethoven V, that's the wrong piece for Fantasia. Yeah. But I think the pieces that Stokowski chose, they all work. I mean, that's an enthralling film from beginning to end. I even like The Rite of Spring.
Yeah. Do you think we should still play Beethoven V? And if we were to program, I'm not saying the South Dakota Symphony.
I can no longer hear Beethoven V. I flee the prospect of having to listen to it. I've just heard it too many times. I guess There are a lot of people who haven't heard it, so I can't say it shouldn't be played. But for people who already know the piece, you're in a kind of a bind because you don't want to do it differently just so people can hear it in a different way. And to do it in the same old way, it's become hackneyed through repetition.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It, of course, depends. South Dakota is not Manhattan.
Right.
I certainly don't think that the New York Philharmonic should be playing Beethoven V.
Yeah. Let's change directions a little bit. A major topic in a lot of your work is the concept of American identity and American music. And talking about the narrative specifically, maybe starting with Dvorak or maybe even predating Dvorak, of trying to find an American sound. And this was something that preoccupied composers, even most recently as Leonard Bernstein, and maybe even today, music composers that are living today, although we are so much more connected and it's much easier to get on a plane and fly to Darmstadt.
Yeah, global now.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your fascination with American identity.
Well, all of my writing begins with my realization that we never really acquired our own classical music culture. It remains Eurocentric. The people who challenge that, I just say to them, look at the repertoire of your local orchestra and opera company. Is most of the music American or European? So it never happened here. It happened in Russia at a fairly late date. They didn't start much earlier than we did, not to mention Germany or Italy or France. We never acquired an American canon, and that's one of the reasons that classical music is marginal. And now the chickens have come home to roost. When I first said that in 1987 in Understanding Toscanini, I was vilified, but I was right. What I said was, this will happen. Classical music will be marginalized in this country. The roots are too shallow. So ever since, I've tried to figure out why that happened, how it happened, and could it have happened otherwise. I have many thoughts on this topic. Firstly, we don't know our own music. We were sold a bill of goods by Aaron Copland and Virgil Thompson, who insisted there was no American music before 1915. Well, that was wrong. We couldn't use the past because it was declared useless. But our greatest symphonic composer happens to predate 1915. His name is Charles Ives. And there's Dvorak's American Suite is American music. The Chadwick Jubilee is a piece every American orchestra should play. Outside of symphonic repertoire, the Griffiths Piano Sonata, which is a little later, 1920, it's a great American piece. Arthur Farwell is an important American composer whose writing consequential music already by 1903, 1905. I would think those John Knowles Paine symphonies, both of them should be played frequently by American orchestras, even if they don't sound American. They're part of the lineage that we've ignored. So that's point one. We don't know our own music.
Yeah.
Point two is we didn't do a good job curating an American style because the modernists, and I'm thinking specifically of Copland, were not comfortable with the vernacular, and in particular the Black vernacular. So this Black musical motherlode, which we're blessed with, which flowered in popular genres, was squandered by American classical musicians, with the conspicuous exception of George Gershwin, who was marginalized as a dilettante as a result. Gershwin is the proof. Porgy and Bess, our highest creative achievement in classical music, is the proof that something more could and should have been done with the Black roots that were ignored and even denigrated. There's also a pretty great symphony by William Dawson, the Negro Folk Symphony from 1934, which still isn't played, which I would rank above the Copland Third Symphony and the Harris Third Symphony. Mm-hmm. So that's a second problem. The first is we don't know our musical past, and the second is that after World War I, we didn't want to know our musical past, and in particular, the parts of it that were rooted in the Black experience, the African American experience. So where do we go now that we're here? Well, our first obligation for sure is to curate the past, which we've so much ignored. We don't even know Ives' Second Symphony. So, as you know, we did a program around Ives' Second Symphony with my favorite American orchestra, the South Dakota Symphony, with David Geyer, in which we introduced people in Sioux Falls to the genius of Charles Ives. We also had a program called Charles Ives, A Life in Music, with Bill Sharp, which we took to South Dakota State University and Augustana College. And the first half of that program had the Gershwin Rhapsody in Blue and the Dvorak American Suite, and there were a lot of visuals and there was a lot of talking. And then we explored the roots of the Ives' Second Symphony, the songs that he quotes, some of which are long forgotten. And we sung things which are not supposed to be heard any longer, like Swanee by George Gershwin, or Camptown Races by Stephen Foster, both of which are considered politically incorrect. So all of this happened in Sioux Falls in an attempt to introduce a great American symphony that's not known and not played. My main interest right now is making known major American composers and major American works that have not achieved the recognition they deserve. Mm-hmm. And that's very specifically Lou Harrison. I'm talking about, let's say, all the Americans.
Yeah.
Lou Harrison, Bernard Herrmann, and Silvestre Revueltas. Those three guys haven't nearly received the exposure and acknowledgement they deserve. Bernard Herrmann, we know because he wrote great film scores, but his clarinet quintet, his symphony, his cantata Moby Dick, you guys should do Moby Dick.
Yeah.
Nobody does it. Revueltas, the mind boggles. I mean, here's a composer who created a highly distinctive and irresistible sonic signature for orchestra.
Yeah.
And just because he's Mexican, we don't know him. I rank him over Copland, no question. And Lou Harrison, I think for me, of the so-called contemporary American composers, although he died about 10 years ago, he's my guy. I think he composed the best American violin concerto, which is for violin and percussion, and the best American piano concerto, although I like the Concerto in F by Gershwin very much. How is it possible we don't know these pieces? This is a master composer. Yeah. So that I think I have my work cut out for me, just making known the importance of Herrmann, Harrison, and Revueltas.
Part of the point of this project, this State of Our Art series, is for me to audit what's going on. It's been a fascination of my own, because at one point I did want to become a composer, and along the way I decided that I enjoyed the process of learning other people's music and studying other people's music more than I liked writing my own. Would you agree with the statement that it is important for us to continue writing music in order for our art to stay relevant and to keep it a living art?
God, yes. I mean, that's a problem that performers stopped composing. When we talked about a half hour ago about modernism, I omitted to say, and I should have, that one of the defining features of that period was not only a schism between the composer and the audience, but between the composer and the performer. That had never been the case before. Think of any important performer. I once challenged, when I talk to pianists, I say, can you think of any pianist before, say, 1900 who wasn't also an important conductor or composer? And I asked the question often enough over a long enough period of time that finally somebody answered, Vladimir de Pachman. So there's one, okay?
I've never heard of him.
Okay, but there is one who only played the piano. But it was not, the norm, of course, was you do multiple things. And I think it's important that resume.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think it's, as much as you talk about contextualizing and cultivating the past, I think we also need to really respond and live in our present moment. Well, Joe, we're wrapping up here. So, any final parting, any final parting shots you would like to give the listeners?
No, I feel that we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
I don't have anything to say beyond what I've already told you on this occasion, Thomas.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Joe.
No, you're very welcome. Yeah.
Great to get back together and speak with you again. So once again, my guest has been Joseph Horowitz, who is currently the executive producer of the Post-Classical Ensemble, and you can find them on postclassical.com. They have some really interesting contextualized music videos, maybe pieces that you may know or pieces that you may not know, and putting them in context is really interesting. He's also the author of 10 books. You can find him on his website, which, Joe, I think is at josephhorowitz.com.
It is.
josephhorowitz.com, and have a look out for a new book coming out sometime in the future called Cultural Cold Wars. Joe, thank you so much for spending time with us.
You're welcome, Thomas.
Hey, it's me again, Thomas Fortner. Thanks so much for watching and listening to this interview. Special thanks to my guest, Joseph Horowitz. This is my first foray into the crazy world of podcasting and YouTubing. There's a big learning curve with all of these technical editing things. Sound design, I just got a new microphone and I'm learning how to use all of this stuff. So with that in mind, I'd still love to hear your comments about what you thought about this interview, what you thought about this series. Do you think it's too long? Would you like it to be longer? Would you like me to ask different types of questions? Do you think this whole project is total baloney? Anything you want to tell me, let me know in the comments. If you feel like you should be a subscriber, I would appreciate that. So like and subscribe, just like all the YouTubers say. I'm going to have a Patreon link below where you can help donate and help support this project and help buy equipment like a better microphone and editing software, etc., etc. I actually have 4 or 5 more interviews already in the editing queue, so there'll be more coming out shortly. And I know that I'm talking really fast, but I'm really excited about this project. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to give special thanks to the composer of my theme music, or our theme music, Vincent Caliano, a great friend, and he very graciously loaned me that music for the very beginning of this film. I'd also like to thank my friend and flight instructor, William Drzymski, CFII, and he put together that lovely time lapse of those clouds at the airport, which I think added a nice little touch for this video. So once again, this has been State of Our Art, and thank you so much for watching and listening. Take care.